Welcome to This Very Moment, a Shambhala Publications podcast. In the second half of this interview with John Canti, he tells some amazing stories about his time with Dudjom Rinpoche, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and others, as well as his time in 2 separate 3-year retreats under their guidance. John also shares some insights from his many years of practice and study. I'm your host, Ivan Bercholz. So this experience at Kongju Rinpoche's cremation was when the group of you kind of established that deeper connection with the Khyentse Rinpoche, and obviously that became a big trajectory of your life going forward from there. Yes. Can you tell me a little bit about how that experience led to you going into the 3-year retreat in Dudjom and how that connection with the Khyentse Rinpoche increased from that point on?
Yes, well, of course, I haven't mentioned him a lot, but all of us owe an enormous amount to Pema Wangyal Rinpoche, who was Kongju Rinpoche's eldest son, and who became an incredible support, I suppose you could say. I don't think he would put it like that, to of course, he had been to his own father, but after his father passed away, he became a very active student of both Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche. And the extraordinary thing that happened in those years just after that, so Kongju Rinpoche passed away in the beginning of 1975. And by the summer of 1975, or even spring, Pema Wangyal Rinpoche had managed to invite Dudjom Rinpoche and Khyentse Rinpoche to visit Europe, and I think the US as well. I'm a little bit more hazy on when those...
Was it at the same time or on separate occasions in the same year?
On separate occasions, but sometimes at the same time.
Okay.
Happened. Yeah, there was a memorable... This was later, I think, but there was a memorable time. No, it was in 1975. There was a memorable time when both Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche were both in Paris at the same time. And one had to choose, which... Yeah, and so that was amazing. And it had sort of happened... Well, one element in the story is that Kongju Rinpoche's French students had often said to him, please come to France. And he said, yes, I will, and they showed him photographs and things like that. And he sort of expressed enthusiasm, but then he, never could. And so somehow that got transferred to the idea that Pema Wangyal Rinpoche skillfully could weave that into the idea, which I suppose must have been already present in minds of Dudjom Rinpoche and Khyentse Rinpoche, that they could and should, visit the West. And of course, there were other influences, I'm sure, pulling them and inviting them. But that year, they both did, and for the following years, and things got established, and Dudjom Rinpoche stayed here, and eventually, this was some years later, his own residence here was established just up the road where you visited when you came. And at the same time, he established a center in New York, in Manhattan, and another one in upstate, at Greenville. And Khyentse Rinpoche, I think he must have been invited also by Trungpa Rinpoche, maybe this was later, to the US. So, and Khyentse Rinpoche would again established a place here was established for him at Masonry, where he could stay, and indeed did come every year from then onwards, would come every year for quite a few months, sometimes twice in a year. And around that time, from the mid-70s towards the end of the 70s, quite a few of my friends and people who had been students in Kongju Rinpoche's monastery in Darjeeling had a very serious inspiration to do some intensive practice. But it was, in contrast to places like Dharamsala and Bir, it was very difficult to stay for a long time in Darjeeling. It's in this small area of West Bengal, which to get to, you have to go through what's called the Chicken's Neck. There's a sort of very narrow corridor where West Bengal, which is a sort of artery of communication, with railway lines and main roads and things, that leads to the rest of India up in Assam and Arunachal Pradesh and all of that part of India over the top of Bangladesh. And ever since, the partition and then the War of Independence for Bangladesh, that whole area has been a sort of hotbed of intrigue and political movements and suspicions of spying and all sorts of things. So any of us foreigners who went to Darjeeling, we were always suspected of being somehow connected with the CIA or spies or something, and there was a lot of paranoia. And it was you had to get a special permit to stay there, and there was somebody whose permanent job it was to keep an eye on who was coming and going at Khyentse Rinpoche's monastery. So things became quite difficult, and people were looking for a place to do serious practice without having all of these hassles. And in the end, Pema Wangyal Rinpoche gave the go-ahead to some ideas people had, particularly here, of establishing a small retreat place where people could stay permanently in Europe and get guidance from him and perhaps other lamas. And so that eventually bore fruit into, kind of increased and increased and increased until actually a proper 3 years retreat center was built from the late 70s, with the idea of having a traditional 3-year retreat, which had already been tried in Europe by Khyentse Rinpoche's students. They had built a place and started 3-year retreat in the east of France, at Plage. So in the meantime, I had continued my qualifications in London and then went back to Cambridge, and I was working as a junior doctor in hospitals and wondering what to do. And I had various jobs, and I was, enjoying life, and it was quite good. But I had this sort of double life where I was also trying to keep as much in contact with my Tibetan teachers and study Buddhism. But I was a little bit disenchanted, I suppose you could say, with the sort of academic medical thing. I had started to do the sort of training of a surgeon, but the kind of lifestyle of surgeons in Britain at the time was very much, sort of rugby, motor cars, drinking, you know what I mean? It wasn't really my scene. And then there was the whole sort of academic rat race and things. And I eventually got a job with an NGO that had a contract from the Nepalese government to run basic tuberculosis case finding program in the hills of Nepal. And I was accepted for this job, and I went off thinking, well, I won't be too far from Darjeeling, I won't be too far from Kathmandu. I'll be able to see Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche from time to time, and that'll be nice, So, and it was a great job, actually. So I went off and in 1978 and lived in Nepal in the hills up near Kanchenjunga, running these quite basic sort of medical services in what was practically a medieval culture. There were no roads. We had to go by foot. The two places I was working in were, a week's walk from the nearest road, and the other one a little bit more than that, up steep hillsides, up and down, and river valleys and things. And everything was on foot. Everything had to be carried. I used to go off on these case-finding journeys to distant villages and, small areas. We'd carry some microscopes and staining equipment and some basic medicines and things, and we'd go off for a few weeks into the middle of nowhere. So it was an amazing job. It was like being on a sort of permanent trekking holiday, but quite difficult.
Sounds like maybe your early experiences in botany might have led to some, practical experience in what you were doing then.
Yes, I think so. Certainly appreciated having heard a lot about the Himalayas from my botany teacher. But
or just the experience of being out and
it was amazing. And one of the things between the two places that I worked, there was a very high ridge that I had to trek over to get from one to the other, where the landscape was absolutely covered with rhododendrons, most glorious blossoms that you ever saw. And, in completely natural, it was a completely natural jungle of sort of rhododendrons and other species. So it was amazing. But yes, it was a very interesting time. I was totally, in a cultural, actually an interesting mixed culture in the Northern Hills. You have, ordinary Nepalis, Brahmins, and various different castes and farmers and things. But you also have these different ethnic groups, Rais, Limbu, Sherpa, Tamang, Gurung, and all these people, some of whom speaking languages that are related to Tibetan, and some of them are actually sort of Tibetan Buddhists. So it was an amazing time, and I really enjoyed it. I was immersed in. I had to do everything I had to learn Nepali quite fluently. Nobody spoke English, and that was a very useful sort of dip into the Indic language sphere. Because I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but it helps to have had that background in, sort of basic Indic roots and so forth. But in terms of being anywhere near the Lamas, it didn't really work too well for two reasons. One is that, I was quite near both Darjeeling and Kathmandu as the crow flies, but not being a crow, it wasn't really like that. It was actually, it would have been quicker to come from London to
Oh my goodness.
than it would have been from where I was, But
Wow.
of course, you just have to walk. Everything was at that pace. And the other reason is that at the same time, the Lamas were spending more and more time going west. And so sometimes, even if I was in Kathmandu or went to Darjeeling, they weren't there. So anyway, I don't know how long I would have stayed otherwise. It was a very interesting job, and I got very involved. But in sometime in early 1980, I suppose, I had a letter saying, we're starting a 3-year retreat in France, and would you like to join? And so I spent a very sleepless night trying to decide what to do. I didn't have any more detail than that. It said, starting soon.
Who was the letter from?
The letter was from a friend of mine, but it was written, with the sort of under the direction of Wangyal Rinpoche.
Oh, okay.
And it was very brief. It was I think it had been sent as a telegram and then carried up from somewhere, wherever the last telegrams arrived. So there was no detail.
Okay.
But anyway, I decided that this was a kind of lifetime opportunity that I wouldn't get again. And although it was, pretty unfair I had just sort of really learnt to be effective after 2 years on the job. And I felt really bad about, the organization having to find somebody else and train them up. But they were very nice about it. And I waited for, I think, about 3 months, and, waited until hopefully my successor would be able to come, although that didn't actually happen. And then I finally left, and I thought I was going to be sort of late or too late, but in fact there were again a few months to spare because we hadn't finished building the place. And
Okay.
so I came back and spent a week or so with my family in England, and came down here to the Dordogne and helped in the final stages of building and getting the place ready, which was again a good sort of formative experience, knocking around with the other people I was going to be cooped up with for 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so Khyentse Rinpoche he'd given some of the necessary transmissions. I had missed that. And then Dudjom Rinpoche came, and then he had to go to New York for a few months. And eventually in December 1980, he came back, and we were put in retreat and given a lot of teachings and empowerments, and started off. And so that was, that was that. And I've sort of been here ever since.
What was the tradition? Was it like what tradition were the liturgies of your retreat? Was it in the Dudjom Tersar tradition or the longtime Nintik?
Well, we had a mixture. Again, this is thanks very much to Pema Rinpoche's sort of belonging to several different lineages.
Yeah.
And he wanted, there were people who'd been mainly Khyentse Rinpoche's disciples, and people who'd been mainly Dudjom Rinpoche's disciples or Khyentse Rinpoche's disciples. And so we were able to combine sort of study with all of the texts which deal generally with the, with the different practices, but also to have a choice of the particular lineage that we were most interested in, and then there were times when we could sort of change over and get a taste of the other. So we all did quite a lot from the Dudjom Tersar, but also generally from the Khyentse lineage, and from the longtime Nintik, and from other related parts of the Khyentse lineage, and from some of Khyentse Rinpoche's own dharmas as well. So it was very again very educational in a way. We weren't just sort of, the horizons weren't just narrowed down to
right. Yeah. And it sounds very unique to that particular set of circumstances, because Tulku Pema Wangyal Rinpoche was the one kind of leading the force. It was, his influences, and what a time to.
It was an amazing time, and of course we realized how lucky we were at the time, but probably never enough, because
we never can.
We would have, these amazing times when Khyentse Rinpoche would come every day for weeks and weeks, or Dudjom Rinpoche would come every day for a long time, and we're staying up the road, and we had visits from the 16th Karmapa, from Kalu Rinpoche, from would come in, would drop by, and the fact that this bunch of Westerners was doing 3-year retreat was somehow meant a lot to them. They little did they know what what hopeless cases we were, but that the fact that we were trying was something.
I think they saw your potential.
Maybe but they were into it, and they came, and they were, of course, again thanks to Pema Wangyal Rinpoche's powers of persuasion. So it was a most extraordinary period. Even for the last year and a half or something like that, we actually had Nyosho Khenpo Rinpoche staying with us in the 3-year retreat.
My goodness.
Teaching and guiding and messing around with us. And it was a very amazing time. Lasted quite a lot more than 3 years. We came out, I think, in early 1985.
So how many years is that?
Well, we started in very late 1980. So 81, 82, 83, we were fully there, and I think all of 84 as well. So it was more like four and a bit years.
Okay.
5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then, Yeah, it was, I think we had unrealistic expectations. I had been with some other friends, we'd been while staying in Darjeeling, we had gone to be at the opening of a 3-year retreat conducted by Chatur Rinpoche in Goom, so just down the road. And he had a small group there, six people, I think, in a dzamkang, in a retreat place. And it happened one time I was there that they were just coming out, and we went to see, there was a kind of feast offering and a sort of ritual as they all came out and met their families and stuff. And it was very inspiring to see these yogis coming out of retreat. And you could see, go and have a look at their different rooms, and some of them had rooms full of, calendars and pictures and things. Some had practically nothing. And they all looked very impressive, with a sort of yogi's hair and robes and things. I learned individual stories of some of them later, and again, it was a mixture. Some did well and some didn't.
Yeah.
It was very inspiring, and we, had the kind of slightly mythologized idea that, you come out of 3-year retreat practically enlightened, highly realized and wise and everything. And of course, as our own time ended, we began to realize that, or speaking personally anyway, I don't know what, I think most of my friends felt the same, that we were kind of pretty half-cooked, and we had learned a lot, and it had been an amazing overview, of all the practices there are to do, but that it would take more than that to really, to really get there and really make something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So many of us felt we should carry on in some way. I had always imagined that I would go back to medicine after those 3 years, take off more than that and your career is pretty much difficult to get back. But anyway, again, it seemed the best thing to do if we could. And so we got the opportunity. There was another group coming in, but we, Pema Rinpoche managed to establish another nearby place where we could do, have a kind of spillover. So many of the second timers went into that place. A few stayed behind with the new intake. And so after another amazing time when both Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche were here giving teachings at the same time, sometimes together, sometimes separately, for a month or so during the summer. We, again, some more building work, and we went back in. Again, very inspiring time. To be in with sort of gang of second timers was very, very good. We all knew each other. It was not quite as hard. Actually, and this is worth saying, one of the most difficult and best things about being in retreat is that you have to deal with the other people.
Yeah.
Retreat like that, it is in a way what makes it. Of course, it's what makes it possible, because it's what makes it worth important lamas coming and spending their time giving teachings. If you were just an individual, then it wouldn't get nearly so much. But from a more sort of experiential point of view, you're stuck with, in our case, so 15, 16 people who you might know, you might not particularly get on with or like. Yeah. Some of them would almost inevitably be difficult characters.
Of course.
And people who come and study Tibetan Buddhism are not perhaps your average, really well-honed, well-adjusted kind of people, but there's no getting away, you can't escape. It's a terrible, the sort of course, it would be perfectly easy to walk out of the door, but the perceived shame and sanctions of doing so are quite strong. So you have to deal with it in some way, and that's incentive. So, yeah. But the second time around, again, that element wasn't lacking entirely. But we were perhaps more used to each other, and again, still an amazing time with Khyentse Rinpoche still there, and Trishik Rinpoche would come and see us quite often as well in that time. But
And it must be in that time, you shared a story with me when I saw you last in person. We were in Dudjom Rinpoche's house, and you shared some stories with me that must have been from that second retreat, where it was toward the end of Dudjom Rinpoche's life, where he spent about a year there at the end.
That's right. Well, tragically, just before we went into that second retreat, he got taken ill and had to be hospitalized in Bercholz, which is the nearest big town here. And his health was, he very nearly died, but his health was very seriously impaired, and he was more or less bedbound, difficult to speak and eat and walk and everything. So I had been called in to help, be the sort of interface with the medical world, and I'd been most of the time with him in the hospital. And when he came back, we were due to start retreat, and I did, but I had I was arranged to have I had a car, so that I was the only person who could actually leave the retreat and drive up the road.
You had the hall pass.
Yes, that's right. So I would go up every day and see him, and do some basic treatments and things, and see how things were getting on, and then come back. But I was the rest of the time, able to practice and study in the retreat. So for me, it was an amazing period, working this close contact with Dudjom Rinpoche and his family, who were extraordinary too. And I don't know if I was any use, but it was a huge benefit to me, to have that, largely non-verbal but very powerful contact for all of that time. And then so that lasted for more than a year, actually, when he was still alive but bedbound and quite seriously ill. And then towards the end of that period, his health declined even further, and eventually one day while I was there, actually, he passed away. And I think I told you the story at the time, and it's difficult to recount it in full without spending many hours again, and we've already taken a lot of time. But just to say, for me, it was one of the sort of peak experiences of my life. Of course, a very sad one, but also extraordinarily meaningful to be with a Lama of his caliber, seeing the end of his life and how he dealt with it, and how it was dealt with, how he actually, not just the end of his life, but also, being seriously sick and bedbound and obviously suffering, but at the same time, maintaining this extraordinary, it's not like a sort of supernatural equanimity and being above being sick, but it's a little bit hard to describe, a kind of acceptance, transcendence, and I sometimes saw it as like, in some ways he was a kind of sick old man suffering in bed. He would even, sometimes get angry with us if we moved a limb too much and it hurt or something. And sometimes he was also all the time incredibly kind and caring, and much more concerned with other people than with himself. But all of the sort of things that were happening and the experiences that whatever he was going through, obviously I don't know what he was experiencing, but you could somehow tell that it was, in a sense, like, the clear sky with clouds going through, and all of those things were really just inconsequential clouds. That's a little bit how I could express it. And don't ask me quite how, I don't know how I can sort of know that, but that's the impression I got.
Yeah.
And then after he passed away, again, I told you the story in detail, but it was extraordinary. He was very weak, and when he passed away, he was actually, really bedbound and would be most of the time lying down or propped up in his bed. But as he passed away, he was sitting up, and he stayed sitting up. I mean, propped up, yes, but he stayed in meditation. And we just, after a while, having made some, slightly tentative attempts at sort of resuscitation, and, we had oxygen and all those things, but it didn't work. And Rinpoche said, just to stop now, we'll just leave him. He has passed away, and there was nothing more to do. And she didn't want anybody to go out of the house. She didn't want the news to go out for as long as possible. So we had nothing to do after working, pretty hard and being intense time trying to sort of do what we could for him. And suddenly there was nothing to do. So in a way, you could say, well, it was just that, but I think it was a lot more than that. We just sat down, and it was midwinter. It was very cold. Sky outside, very clear sky. And I am not, honestly, I'm not just being modest. I'm not a great meditator, and I don't have a lot of success trying to sort of sit still and just, stay in meditation. But for those few days, which was, it lasted quite a long time, there was nothing you could do to not, be sort of somehow in meditation. And it was the most extraordinary time experience. So I just stayed there. There were Pema Rinpoche's brother and Dudjom Rinpoche's main attendant, and we would sort of sit. We would sit there sometimes in his presence, sometimes outside in the sitting room, and we weren't allowed to go anywhere anyway, and we just ate and slept and sat there. And eventually, after a few days, I was allowed to go back into the retreat, and by then, at least my friends had sort of heard the news, and news had got out, and there were discussions going on about what to do next. But Dudjom Rinpoche himself stayed in Tukdam for 10 days. And it was very obvious that this wasn't a normal death, if you like. And we even had to get there were various papers that once the Lamas decided that his Kudung, his body, was going to be not to be cremated, but was going to be preserved and placed in a stupa in Nepal. So we had to do all sorts of papers that are necessary if you don't just, if a dead person doesn't just go to the local cemetery. It's going to has to be moved. There's transport. There's all sorts of things that date back from early days when people maybe did dodgy things with bodies. So we had to get a specially legally qualified doctor to come and certify that he really had passed away, and that he was fit to be what people would normally see as embalming, although we weren't going to do anything with chemicals and all of that. This doctor came one day. It was about at least a week after Dudjom Rinpoche had actually passed away, and I kind of went to greet this doctor and show him in. He said, "Well, you realize, of course, I have to examine him and do it properly, and see if I can draw blood and that kind of thing." So I said, "Well, I don't want to prevent you from doing what you have to do, but according to Tibetan tradition, we try and disturb somebody in this state as little as possible." So he sort of brushed me off a bit, and then I took him to the room where Dudjom Rinpoche's Kudung was, and he stood at the door and he looked in, and everything changed completely, and he said, "Are you sure he's dead?"
Wow.
So I said, "Yes." he stopped breathing, a week ago, and he said, well, I'll take your word for it, I'm not going anywhere. And yeah, he
Wow.
signed the papers, and he was completely, I think he just understood, that it was not something that was normal.
And he could just tell that from the presence of walking in the room, even without any context. It was just palpable.
Right. He just stood in the doorway, and he could see, that this was not something usual. So he signed the papers, and then again it lasted a few more days, and then Rinpoche's body kind of slumped forward a little bit and changed color, and the Lama said, time has come and his meditation's finished, and proceed with. So they did this preservation of the body, using traditional methods of salt and some camphor, and a big sort of box was built to contain the Kudung and all the salt, so that the fluids could all be drained out and the body would be gradually sort of desiccated, preserved. And they went on for many months. They had to change the salt first of all, every few days, then, twice a week, then a week, and so forth, gradually decreasing. Every time it happened, the police had to come. And again, this is following the laws. They had to put a seal, when everything was done, they had to put a seal on the box as if it was a kind of coffin, a sealed coffin. And then before anybody could open it for the next time, they would have to be there to witness that the seal hadn't been broken. So this would usually happen at night, and I would come and greet them, and they would come in and they'd examine the seal, and the Lamas would break it and start the process, and the police would sit in the sitting room. I would give them coffee. It was usually in the middle of the night. Give them coffee, and sometimes we'd watch TV, and for 2 or 3 hours for the process to be finished, and then finally they would come and put when everything was tidied up and finished and the box had been closed again, they'd come and put their seal on it, and then go away for the until the next time. And actually, the captain of police and his deputy, they would come over all of this time, over many months, come regularly at night, and they became really somehow really attached to coming and fond of being there, And eventually, when the period was over, well, this was a couple of years later, when the stupa in the monastery in Bodha had been completed and it was ready for the Kudung to be taken, the police were really upset as we left, in a sort of procession with the Kudung, and they were crying and very moved. And I often
so touching.
After that, yes, it was very very touching. So yes, after that time, actually by then we had just come out of our second retreat, and we all it was all arranged. There was going to be this big ceremony in Bodha, and at that time, Royal Nepal Airlines had a weekly flight to Frankfurt. It was the only international flight that they had. More recently, they haven't been allowed to do that because they have such a terrible record for maintenance and crashes and things. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but anyway, that's what I understood. But it was arranged that the weekly flight to Frankfurt would be diverted to Paris, and we put the Kudung in its box on a bus, and we all drove. There was a group of about 20 or 30 people from here who drove with it up to Paris to the airport, and it was placed that the airline wanted to put the Kudung in the hold, but we said no, that's not okay. And by some extraordinary fluke, there was the box had been made 2 or 3 years before, and it was just within about 1 millimeter on either side. It was just small enough to go into the main cabin door.
Oh.
And so they took out some seats at the front of the plane, and it was possible for it to be placed in the front 2 rows instead of the seats. And we all came in. I think there must have been a few tourists as well, but basically the plane was full of disciples, students, people from the Dharma Center, and we all went off to land in Kathmandu, where there was a procession, and all of the Lamas in Kathmandu had. It was an amazing, from the airport to Bodhas, I suppose, a few miles. The whole road, although it was middle of the night, the whole road was lined with people, with lamps and scarves and things. And they had an elephant, which was supposed to carry the Kudung, but that was a bit too dangerous and possible. It was very heavy, so it was placed on a truck with, Lamas playing the gyalings and the conches and things. And then there was a ceremony of putting it into the stupa that had been built in the enlarged Gompa there, and still there.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was quite a saga. But
and all of that happened in the middle of this second retreat, or
no,
retreat concluded by?
Yes, only the last bit, the journey to Nepal. We by then that was we'd been in retreat for 3 years or a little bit more.
Okay.
And so we came out to do that. That was the first thing we did as we came out of retreat.
Wow, I mean, of course, it's always sad when the world loses one of its great teachers, but it's also, I can say from experience as well, like one of the most powerful, things that you can experience as a practitioner.
Yes.
So it must have been such an amazing experience, coming directly out of it for everyone. And
it was, and I feel, so privileged to have, I probably didn't say this, but at some point when I first met, Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche, I felt that this was so inspiring and wonderful, and I wanted to sort of just dive into practice and forget being a doctor and all of that. And they all said, no, you carry on. You have to qualify. It's good. It'll be useful. We're not going to stop you doing that. It's a practice too. So I did, and qualified and worked and so forth. And of course, later on, it gave me an extraordinary access to the Lamas. So I was able to be, again, not time to tell all the stories today, but I was able to be present during the passing of several extraordinary practitioners. Of course, Dudjom Rinpoche himself, Yosho Ken Rinpoche was also with him when he passed away. And I was on the way to Bhutan when Tengu Khyentse Rinpoche passed away, so I arrived very soon afterwards, but unfortunately too late. And several other, lesser known practitioners. So that to see them in their final years and their final passing has been, a huge privilege and something that it was more than well worth spending all of those years studying medicine to be able to have access to. Of course, there were other benefits.
Yeah.
I hope to have been able to help some other people as well. And indeed, being, I think some of my friends were keen to have me join the retreat because it was useful to have a doctor there.
Yeah, in the border.
Yeah, it's like being a doctor on board a ship. You can't really rely on anything from the outside world, but so you have to do your best. And being in the middle of remote villages in Nepal, trying to deal with things was actually quite a good training for dealing with medical problems in retreat. Not that we had anything as terrible as tuberculosis or some of the other things I saw in the hills, but
I want to be aware of your time and that it's getting into the evening there. So no, I could sit here all day. Nico and I often talk about, our ideal of a good time is sitting by a fireside, drinking a cup of tea, listening to your Woolston tell stories. So this is like, this is, I could go all night, but can I ask for one more recollection, and then we'll go into. I would love to hear. We've heard stories to some extent about Khyentse Rinpoche and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche, but maybe more about Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche at this point. I'm just curious if you have a recollection of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche that stands out in your mind, that kind of like when you think of Rinpoche and it makes you smile, or like, it's like the memory that stands out in your mind about Khyentse Rinpoche.
Well, many things, of course.
Of course.
I was, again, incredibly lucky to spend time with him, sometimes, as a doctor, sometimes as a student, sometimes in groups, and sometimes individually. One of the things I think is worth saying, these three extraordinary lamas were so different from each other. And I always found that very encouraging. It's not like they're kind of produced from the same mold. Each of these great lamas retained their own personality and their own individual identity, but at the same time being, who they were and transcending it. And sort of, in a way, they almost became more themselves, I would say, than less. So Khyentse Rinpoche was the one I spent the least time with, because he passed away after I'd, come back for the second time, and my first time was only a few weeks. So I spent much more time with the other two, and their styles were so interesting and different. Dudjom Rinpoche was an incredible scholar and writer, and he worked, I'm told, on his texts. He worked incredibly hard to get them exactly right, and he would go over them again and again and again with his scribes and rewrite parts and perfect them. And yet when he talked, he was really casual. You know what I mean? He would teach in this sort of conversational style, and he would say, when we talk about awareness, we're talking about, it's kind of, it's like this, it's sort of, and then he'd sort of lean into who he's talking to. And often when he was giving us teaching as a group, he would be almost as if he was concentrating entirely on Pema Rinpoche, who was his sort of direct interlocutor. And he had all these little expressions and things that he put in. It was really, really kind of conversational and informal, and of course, extremely engaging and profound. So his writing style and his speaking, teaching style were very different. Khyentse Rinpoche, you may have heard some recordings or something, but he would come in and sit down, and whatever time there was available, he would fill it uniformly. He would rom, and this teaching would pour out with not a great deal of expression, but perfectly spoken, grammatical, long sentences, and with all the subjects kind of included just at the right time. And then he would come to a rolling conclusion with a dedication just at the end of the allotted time. It was kind of like he was reading from some sort of book in his mind. And but apparently when he wrote, it was the opposite. He would write something or dictate it. I think he would usually write it out himself and then give it to his scribes to complete. And having written the first draft, he was completely uninterested in improving it or anything. He would just leave it to the other lamas and scholars to do that. So I think that's kind of, again, an interesting, complete character difference, if you like. In some ways. And so as I've said, Khyentse Rinpoche was kind of scary. You feel he's kind of looking through you. He wasn't fierce or unkind. I'm sure he could be, but I never really experienced that. I felt perhaps a little mocked, and but nothing more severe than that. But kind of scary all the same. Dudjom Rinpoche was totally soft and kind, and I did see him getting angry and getting upset with people. Fortunately, not me, and that was something. And he could be very vehement, but most of the time he was very, very straightforward and conversational and smooth. He'd let his family. He was really a sort of family figure as well. And yet I heard, I told you these stories about how actually he, towards the end of his life, he coached a French guy who was helping to look after him about how to iron shirts. And he showed him how he did it himself. And although, many of his family, they had lots and lots of clothes and go out dancing and they liked stuff, But he himself had 3 shirts all the time that he circulated. He'd wear it for one day and then he'd wash his own shirts. And he'd wash his own shirt at the end of the day that he'd worn it, and then it would dry the next day, and then the next day he would also iron the shirt that had been drying the day before, so they would circulate like that. So he had 3 shirts and I think 2 tubas, and that's all. It was very, very simple, and he liked to maintain that, look after it all himself. Khyentse Rinpoche was, what can you say, is so impressive, physically impressive. And lots of people, of course, remarked on that. He was so huge. He was more and more bent over in his late life, because he was so enormous, but and it wasn't easy for him to stand up straight. If he'd stood up straight, I'm quite tall. He's much taller than me. I think much taller really than anybody I know. He was huge. And he would, if he gives you a chawang, put his hand on your head for a blessing, somebody described it as being like having a ham put on your head, There'll be fingers all around the outside of your head, sort of like big warm sort of ham. And sometimes I had to, pretend to examine him and take his pulse and things, and listening with a stethoscope to his heart. He had this vast chest, and I had the impression a little bit like, I'm not small, but I felt sometimes like an ant, on an elephant, because he was so impressive. And I would put my stethoscope on his chest, and I could hear this heart, like in the distance, like in a cave, going boom, boom, boom. It's kind of, that's the sort of impression I had. But we were given some extraordinary opportunities seeing him. At one point, he stayed for a few days when we were in retreat, or I think it was in a sort of mini retreat that we did afterwards, and he was teaching us. And we were allowed to go in and sit with him for sort of sessions during the night as well as the day. When you could see him, he didn't sleep a lot, but he would lie down and sleep. And he was quite extraordinary because even while he was sleeping, he would be holding a mala and still apparently reciting and counting mantras or recitations of something, I don't know what. And I also saw him, sometimes he would be giving a teaching which required translation. And while the translation was going off, he would, late in life, he would obviously completely go to sleep. And then when the translation was finished, he would wake up and absolutely no break in continuity, continue straight it was like for him, you could really see that sleep was something completely different from what it is for us, when we can lose consciousness of what we're doing and all of that. And again, remarkable, I saw him several times, and other people have said the same. He could multitask in a way that I've never seen anybody else be able to do. He could write. He could be writing a text, talking to somebody, and also reciting something with Mala at the same time. And I've no doubt that he was doing it, with perfect concentration on all three.
Complete in all three. Wow.
Channels, if you like.
Yeah.
And so he really was impressive and extraordinary. And again, a totally different style. There were times, I think perhaps later in life it was more difficult, but there were times when he was in his monastery in Kathmandu or anywhere else beforehand, he would be open to all visitors all the time. People would come by, there would be a line of people, perhaps not all through the night, but, from late at night until very early morning, and people could come and ask him for divination or ask for teachings or ask for a lung or ask for this or that or a blessing and he would, his attendants would not, they wouldn't block anybody. Anybody could come. And he was totally open. Of course, he could get on with his things because he had this amazing multitasking ability. Perhaps that's why, how. But he was very, very, what could you say? There was a sort of rolling smoothness to everything he did. And I remember you really felt that he had this sort of perception that somehow everything was the same and fine. And I remember one time I turned up in Darjeeling and I didn't know who was where, but I turned up in Darjeeling was just before I started working in Nepal, and Khyentse Rinpoche was there, but he was going to leave the next day for Kathmandu by car. So I was also trying to get to Nepal, so I was invited to join. And I traveled in the car most of the time in Khyentse Rinpoche's car. I think I even drove it during the night at some point. And the first problem was when we came to the border crossing at a place called Itahari. You normally have to stop and have your passport stamped and make sure they have a visa. But when these Bhutanese gang, driving Khyentse Rinpoche, they had a sort of army jeep and official car and diplomatic number plates. They just honked the horn and kept driving. And the people who have these, barriers over the road, they were startled and they just had to lift the barriers. So we went shooting through. So I found myself in Nepal without any proper stamps in my passport, because, just we never stopped. It caused some problems later. But during the night, we were supposed to stop and spend the night where Khyentse Rinpoche had been invited to stay at the King Birendra's hunting lodge, which was somewhere in the plains between Itahari and Kathmandu. And somehow in the night we missed the turning and we didn't get there. We didn't manage to stay there. And so we had to stop somewhere for the night. And no, it wasn't. Just trying to remember the names. But anyway, we ended up at a kind of major crossroads in Nepal that later I knew very well because it was on the way that I would take from Biratnagar, which is a town in the southeast of Nepal, to go up to the hills. And it was a real dive of a place, a sort of impoverished village, with piles of refuse and shacks and really not at all prepossessing. But anyway, this was the only place that there was any sort of small town. So we stopped there and Rinpoche's attendants, they got out some bedding and things. And we went into what was called a hotel, which in Nepali really means basically a restaurant, somewhere you can have rice and vegetables. And they sometimes have places in the back, where there are some sort of wooden beds, and people who, porters and people who are traveling can sleep there. So we went into the back of this place, which was, there were clouds and mosquitoes everywhere and terrible stench. And we had to walk on a plank over a sort of filthy ditch. And it was a real dive, And somehow the attendants, they spread this bedding out. And somehow it was as if we were I can't explain it. We were somehow in a sort of palace. So we weren't in the king's hunting lodge, which presumably would have been quite luxurious, but we were in this total dive of a place, and it felt fine, Khyentse Rinpoche was entirely even-minded about the whole thing, He didn't care where he was. He could be in a king's palace, or he could be in a trucker's dive, and it didn't make the slightest difference. So, that's, again, one of the many, many sort of memories I have of spending time with him that kind of wasn't in public. But again, so many times when he would be giving empowerments and teachings, and to just be able to be in his presence and listen and take in some of these extraordinary teachings that he gave in those times. It was amazing.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all these wonderful stories about your many beautiful and inspiring teachers. And it's so inspiring for students to hear, about the great teachers of the recent past. And I always love listening to such stories. And I feel like we could go on in this light for days on end. But I want to kind of turn toward the conclusion of our interview. So, you've been on this path for many years at this point and received countless teachings and transmissions. And as you get older and the teachings settle into your being, is there a simple teaching that stands out to you as like a guiding light for your day-to-day, like a reminder for you every day, or something that you've kind of settled on in your day-to-day practice and experience that stands out, that's become more integral in your life at this point?
Gosh, yes, I suppose for me, the core of it all has always been, what is this experience? And I think the if I compare it to the kind of attempts that I heard of trying to explain Christian perspectives and belief in God, when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager, the things that I didn't understand, I suppose in a way are this same sort of order. But what struck me so much when I came across Tibetans was how pragmatic they were, that you don't have to worry about what you believe or not. You do this, you do that, you try this, you think about this, you go through all of these stages, and one thing leads to another, and there you are. There's a whole, I wouldn't say logic to it, but there's a whole sequence of thoughts. And of course, coming up to all the magnificent teachings of, Vajrayana and the deity yoga and all of those things. But to me, what really strikes me as the kind of core running through it all is this idea, what really is this mind? What is this awareness that we have all the time, and especially from the perspective, of the Buddha nature teachings, that the goal of awakening is not to add something extraordinary to what we can experience, but simply to experience it as it really is, and to get beyond all the kind of concepts and coverings and so forth that we have about it. And the idea that just a very simple idea that somehow, somewhere in this experience that I'm having, right now, there is supposed to be the full thing, the whole idea of awakening and all the Buddha qualities and all the rest of it. So obviously, in my case, I'm very aware that it's totally lost and covered up. But the very idea that it's somehow there, and just reflecting on that and thinking, at any moment, might be walking or might be actually meditating or might be studying or writing or something. But at all of those moments, to try to remember, to kind of look at what is actually, what can I really feel is there, and how can I, be in that state that all of the texts describe and that I've had explained to me and pointed out so many times. How can I stay more in that, and how can I uncover it more, and how can I finally, stop trying to do more, if you like, and stop trying to get better at it, because that's not really the point. So that to me is the sort of big central question that has driven me and remained really since the beginning. And I feel very privileged and inspired to have been exposed to it for so much of my life. Not sure I really still have, an incredible experience and answer to what all of that is, but I've been trying, and it's a constantly absorbing reflection or consideration or task, or I don't know quite how to describe it, but it's to me the central point of really all of the teachings and all of the extraordinary implications that Buddhist traditions of all kinds have built around it, but focusing in always on that single point. What are we really experiencing, and what does it really mean to be alive, and to be conscious and to be aware, and how does that relate to other people, to others, to time, to our bodies, to all the rest of it. That those questions, take all kinds of different perspectives, but they all hinge around that single central point, which to me seems really what it's all about.
Wow. Thank you, John. I can't imagine a better point to end on than that. And so I'll just say once again, thank you so much for joining for this conversation. I can't imagine a better first guest for this podcast series. And
I can.
but
Anyway, but I'm happy to kick off and see where it gets to.
it was a real pleasure, and it was such a wonderful experience as a listener, firsthand live, and I'm sure many people will enjoy it as a after the fact experience. So just thank you from myself and from Shambhala Publications as a whole, and for all the future listeners to this, for sharing so much about your life and your experience with your teachers. And we didn't even get into the prolific work that you've done as a translator. We didn't even touch on that for a moment. So we might have to have you back a second time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for making it so easy. Actually, it's a pleasure talking to you, and so that makes it's just as you say, like having a conversation, which is the best way of bringing up memories. I'm sure that now, once we finish, I'll be thinking of all kinds of things that I really wanted to say and didn't, or stories that I should have said. But anyway, that's life, isn't it? And we have to leave it like that.
I hope you enjoyed the first episode of This Very Moment. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite platform so you don't miss an episode. Interviews with Garab Dorje Rinpoche, Pamela Ayoyatunde, and Diane Musho Hamilton are coming soon.